What is intelligence?
Some of your readers may know that Alan Turing, who is one of the founders of today's computer science, wrote a very famous article back in 1953 that was directed towards precisely this question about what is intelligence? And he answered it with a kind of twist, which was he said, oh, intelligence is in a way uh, too ill-defined and too vague to even discuss properly.
Hello, and welcome to this very special final episode of this season of Justify. As we conclude the season, we focused on international law and the future of the global order. But today, we'll discuss what is arguably the elephant in the room: artificial intelligence and what it will do to this global order, and to our lives, actually, for that matter. In the last 5 years, AI has moved from research labs into every corner of our lives. For some, it promises extraordinary leaps in productivity. For others, it evokes fears of surveillance, disinformation, and geopolitical arms races. And for many, it does both of these things at the same time. But beyond the hype, what actually does count as intelligence? Are today's large language models truly thinking, or are they just sophisticated mimics of communication? And what will the world look like? This world of AI. Few people are better placed to address these questions than Professor Bob Berwick, Professor of Computer Science at MIT. His research spans natural language processing, computational models of human language acquisition, and the foundations of human language. With Bob, we'll discuss what his understanding of language is and what artificial intelligence will do to the world that we know. Thanks very much, Bob, for being with us here today.
And,
Great.
and, and thank you very much for
Oh,
hosting me.
it's our pleasure. So let's get started. So let me ask you the most fundamental question. What is intelligence?
Well, you've hit on exactly the key point because, to my mind, after you know, looking at language and human thought for over 35 years, then at the center of it, many would say that intelligence is what actually language brings to the fore. And so the question then is exactly what is intelligence? And uh, this was thought about for many years in the 17th century, all the way up to the present day when modern computers arrived. And some of your readers may know that Alan Turing, who is one of the founders of today's computer science, wrote a very famous article back in 1953 that was directed towards precisely this question about what is intelligence? And he answered it with a kind of twist, which was he said, oh, intelligence is in a way uh, too ill-defined and too vague to even discuss properly. And I think the reason he said that is because we as human beings are, as intelligent creatures, we project so easily onto others the notion that you and I are both intelligent people and that your listeners are intelligent. And and for that reason, we're very easily fooled. Uh, so that's why your question about whether these machines are just being mimics and fooling us as to whether they're really intelligent is really to the point. And
But do you think Turing dodged the question, or
well, I
is
think
there an
well, I
answer
think
there?
yeah, that's a good point to raise. I think he was being very clever in that but he had a valid point, which is that in a way, our sense of intelligence when we're talking to someone else is actually a kind of emotional reaction rather than any kind of, real litmus test or metric. And so for that reason, it's more of our own projection of what we think intelligence is. onto something else. And
Right.
so that was, in fact, his way to actually dodge this question of what intelligence comes to and
So
what
that's interesting that you use the word emotional, and it's a projection and it's emotional. And so, if we were to then look at these machines and what they are doing today, is it our projection that they are intelligent, or is it something fundamental that makes them intelligent or not intelligent?
Right. Well, I think it's actually fundamentally a kind of emotional reaction, our projection, because for the most part, the way these systems are trained on the entire internet and anything beyond, uh, as you said, even to things that aren't exactly true, because it's scraping the entire internet. Because of that, they can pitch up with segments and language that strung together looks like something we would say, because after all, it in fact is just cobbling together elements that it has seen that we've written down before.
Right.
And so that, of course, looks like human language, but I think only from a very surface point of view. So let me give you an example. So one of the oldest examples of this kind of chatbot type system was done by a professor back at MIT in the middle 1960s. His name was Joe Weizenbaum, and he decided to simulate a kind of Rogerian psychologist. And so you would interact with the system and say, and it would ask you a question. It would say, well, tell me something about yourself. And the person would say, oh, I'm worried about my mother. And then it would go on, you would go on and talk with it. And then a few minutes into the conversation, it would say, well, earlier you spoke of my mother. So, of
Mm.
course, all this system consisted of was just few very simple templates and responses to these keywords that it had heard previously in the conversation. So, but the interesting point was that Weizenbaum deliberately stated, oh, this is an extremely simple system. I think
Yeah.
anyone today, a secondary school student could write something like this in just a matter of minutes. And yet
True.
people actually, as they do today, they feel very rapidly that they're actually talking to an intelligent, entity, a person on the other side, even though it's very, very simple. And what that says to me is that we're very easily fooled. So that because we're very easily fooled and we've come over many thousands of years to just accept any kind of interchange like this as something with another person, that it's extremely subtle and extremely easy to be misled in this way, even from a
So,
system that's not very sophisticated.
is it your argument that what we see today with either ChatGPT or Gemini or any of the others, is it essentially a version of what Weizenbaum did in the 21st century? Are we
Right,
getting fooled?
right. No, I think it actually is. It's just, of course, it's so much more sophisticated because it has in its computer memory, many thousands of texts and whatever it is people have done. I once estimated that the training data, as people know, that they train this on the entire web. It's as if you had sat down yourself and started reading one book every half an hour, and you read continuously for for about 10,000 years. That's the amount of information. And I would bet that you would be a lot smarter and a lot more quick on your feet, particularly because the machines you see don't have any notion of forgetfulness. So it would, as if you had read all these works and hadn't really forgotten any word and could pull up any sequence of those words at will, no matter what
Yeah.
the other person was uh, typing to you. And because of that, it seems very fluent. And of course, the other part that makes it very fluent is they have actual people on the other end that actually look at the responses the machine makes and says, "Oh yeah, this is something that looks like what a person would do," and then they make the machine more adapted towards that end, as opposed to something where it says something that's a little bit off, and then of course the people looking at it will reinforce that less and say, "Oh, that's not quite what the machine should do." So
Yeah.
that sort of, input and output, which is all we're looking at, means that there's nothing going on behind the scenes. And I think it's important for people to remember that even though it has words that are in the sentences it gives back, like it'll put, you know, Gemini and Google search engine, it'll say, oh, those are two closely related things. It doesn't really understand what those words mean. And because
Mm.
it doesn't, it's just associating them. It's a kind of Pavlovian or, stimulus response, just an association between two items, but it doesn't really go underneath that surface to actually what I would say is true intelligence, which is being able to think how those words are actually what they actually mean in the world. It doesn't know that.
So
So it,
this is actually very interesting. And uh, one analogy that comes to my mind when you just said this, that Gemini and Google are associated things, it can say it, which sounds right, without understanding what it means, is of my 4-year-old son. Because my
right,
4-year-old son seems to be able to repeat words of songs
right.
almost perfectly, without, of course, understanding a word of what it means. Well, unless he has some level
It
of
actually
understanding that
knows.
I'm not
Yeah.
aware of, but maybe he does. But I think he doesn't understand the words because it's in a language that, like, he's been singing the South African national anthem now pretty perfectly.
That's
I'm
right.
sure he doesn't understand a word of that. Of that. Uh, so I wanted to understand: is it something similar? Is it how a child also associates without understanding, or is it different from a human child?
Well, to my mind, it's a bit different because it's true that children initially pick up words and sounds, but they then take that association further and actually integrate it into their memory of how they've acted in the world and what those words might actually mean. So let me give you an example. So people, of course, have studied the way language acquisition might work in kids, and it is truly a remarkable thing for anybody that's been a parent. So we know that within the first 2 or 3 years of a child's life, they actually pick up enough of the way the language is put together to be able to talk to you. And your son probably does that unless he gets, there's something he gets angry with. And then it's this process goes on and probably ends by about puberty when we know the brain actually either matures or immatures, depending on your point of view as a parent and what do you think of your child. But but the point here is that one of the things we've known from studying this is that children can actually learn a new language by just watching television, where so they would see the South African anthem played and they would hear the words, but they'd also have the pictures and the things going on that are associated with it. And
Mm.
from that, you can actually we know that children can learn a language. But here's the point, which is that we also know that children can't learn a new language by just listening to the radio. So
Right.
if there's no connection with the actual world that's outside in terms of either pictures or actually walking around outside in the world and connecting with it, then we don't learn. So
Right.
notice that the computers actually are not connected. It's as if they're listening to the radio because they're
Mm.
not actually out in the world, either manipulating objects or interacting with it in this physical sense, rather than just purely in terms of texts. So what
Mm.
they're doing is this pure association. And kids initially start with that, but then they can connect with it in a much deeper way by actually interacting with the things that are going on in the world. And that
No,
we think
that's
is connected to some real notion of intelligence and reasoning. The machines don't have that.
No, that actually reminds me of your book with Noam Chomsky on why only us about language
Right.
and evolution,
Yeah.
and from that work or other work that you have done, I mean, what does the evolution of language reveal about human intelligence? I mean, that's and how does that? I mean, I'll come to that later, but how does that contrast with what large
Sure.
language models are doing? But what, from your work, what does language have to do with intelligence?
Well, we think that what language actually enables, which is very interesting, is it actually acts as a kind of universal glue that puts together the various kinds of inputs we get from our seeing in the world, from, our touch, our taste, all these other sensory inputs and other kinds of inputs that we get. And it acts as a kind of lingua franca or common language that glues those things together. So I can give you another fun example that people have done, which is that you can show that if you disrupt language, then you also disrupt the ability to put together the various kinds of sensations you get from the world. So if I hold up like my cell phone, then I not only can see it, but I can touch it, and of course I interact with it in different ways. So that's putting together very different kinds of modalities and inputs, and then I describe it as a cell phone.
Yeah.
But again, the machines can't do that, of course. They just see the text cell phone. They don't see the rest of it. So the point is we can actually dig into that a little bit further in a fun way. So what you can do is you can do a kind of experiment where if you take a room and you put something that a child might want, like a toy, in the corner of the room, and you hide it behind a box. So you put it in one corner of the room, and one wall of the room is painted a different color, blue.
Sure.
So here's what you can do. So you can show the child, oh, I put the toy over here in the corner over here. And then you
Mm.
put a blindfold around the child and you spin them around so they don't, you get them
They don't
disoriented.
know which side they're looking. Yeah.
They don't know what side they're looking at. And then you take off the blindfold and you say, okay, go find the toy.
Yeah.
And what you find is they use the fact that, oh, it was on the side of the wall that was blue to find the toy quickly. So that's a
Okay.
kind of reasoning that puts together both language because you're asking them to, go find the toy along with, what the room looks like and the color.
Yeah.
Now, what happens if you disrupt language? And so it turns out you can disrupt the language if you ask them to do some other language activity while they're trying to find the toy. So if
Yeah.
you ask them to recite a nursery rhyme, or with an adult, you can ask them to read something. It turns out that sort of jams the system of language, which put together some kind of representation. Oh, the toy was in the corner of
Mm.
the room where the wall was painted blue.
Yeah.
And so what I just said in words is a kind of mental picture about what
Yeah.
was going on in the world. And we think that that's what language does. It lets us construct a mental picture that's a representation that's inside our heads that puts together information from many different sources.
But this seems fundamentally different from what large language models are doing. So it doesn't
Exactly.
seem like we are
That's right.
mimicking human beings at all. I
No,
mean, that,
no,
yeah.
that's exactly the point. Is it's as if there's this world the large language models are operating on, which is more or less sort of the first step, as you said, like with your child, of just learning to imitate and learning to associate different words. That's sort of it's like an iceberg where that's sort of floating on the surface. But below that is a whole apparatus of how human beings paint pictures inside our heads with words. And we know that, in any good novel, you open the first page and you start constructing in your head this world of what the novelist is actually writing about. And we all have this sense when we're thinking that that's what's going on. And
Yeah.
what Chomsky and I have tried to argue is that, yes, in fact, that is what's going on. There are words, but the words then into something very much like an iceberg below the surface, which is a kind of mental snapshot of what the world is about. It might not be a real world, like if it's something that's in a piece of fiction, but it's still
Yeah.
a much richer representation of
No,
what's happening. But the
yeah, no, because
models, language
I was
models
just
don't do
thinking
much
about.
job.
Sorry, please continue. Please finish. Yeah.
Oh, no, no. No, I was just saying that the large language models are just operating at the surface of
Yeah.
what happens after you've taken away those mental snapshots, and all you're left with is the words. And so they can associate, Google with Gemini search engine.
Yeah.
They can associate those things, but they don't go below the surface into what's really being understood in the
That's
same
really
sense.
interesting. No, because when you were saying it, what struck me was that if I just hear the word chair, now, the moment I hear the word chair, it's a mental image of a chair comes to my mind. It could be a chair
Right.
that I've seen from the time of when I was young. It could be the chair right in front of me now. But it always is multi-sensory.
Right.
It's never just one. It's never a
Okay.
word. Uh, so, uh, so then that leads me to my next question: that do you think that, and I'm talking the near future here, maybe the next 10, 20 years, do you think large language models, maybe the name itself might change, will become multi-sensory in some way?
Well, there's certainly people have proposed that they're going to have to actually somehow link in these other sensory factors, somehow have the computer interact with the world in this way, in the way that people do. But it's actually at this point, I would say it's difficult to imagine how is exactly going to be done. And I think it's going to have to involve some deeper understanding of how it is that people actually represent and manipulate. Uh, we don't really know how it's done. In fact, that's been the work of cognitive scientists and other scientists for the last 70 years in the modern era. The, so we're going to have to attack it in that symbolic way somehow. But I don't think there are any uh, proposals for in detail how the large language models are going to actually do that. So let me
Yeah,
put
like
it another way.
taste and smell. Like will a large language
Yeah,
model be able to smell?
that's right.
Mm.
But not just smell, but so another way of thinking about it, uh, it's as if when human beings, when you and I talk and interact, as I said, I think a better kind of image is that we construct, as you said, pictures and representations inside our heads of what's going on about chairs and people and events. We have this kind of representation inside our heads. And then what happens when we want to say something, it's like taking a projector and projecting that out into the outside world. And we say whatever words we want to say that are associated with that. And it's like having a film where you've done, something complicated has happened and you project the image of the film onto a screen. And what the large language model is somehow doing is just looking at the screen and not
Mm.
looking at all the other things that went on before the projection ever happened.
No, that's
And so
right.
they're, in a way, working with a very impoverished set of items. They're just looking at the after effects of thinking and intelligence, rather than looking at, well, what was the actual machinery that led to the words that you just said? And that's why, people often complain, oh, these large language models are opaque. And in fact, I think that's correct because they're opaque in the same sense that our own thinking process is opaque. We don't have any personal, internal feelings of, what's the actual machinery that's going on so that I said, dog instead of cat. We don't have any internal sense of
But
that.
is it there? We don't have an internal sense, you're right. But can we have an internal sense of that?
Well, I think that's another fine question. I think that a lot of the internal machinery is actually opaque to thought, uh,
Hmm.
direct experience. I mean, that's why we have psychotherapists, right? Because they're
Right.
they're supposed to elicit these kinds of things that are actually hidden from our direct access.
Right.
But I think it might be even more subtle than that, that the way that because people for thousands of years have tried to understand what is it about any kind of creative process or any kind of thinking so that something bubbles to the surface and we have some idea maybe when we go to sleep and we're thinking about a problem that something's floating around in our heads and we put together thoughts into something more complex and eventually we it gets to what we want to say about it, but a lot of that is opaque to our own direct access
Hmm.
and uh, not clear how that's going to be actually tackled without, actually going through some kind of science that actually can get at that because we don't have ourselves direct access to our internal sensations of that sort, to our own
So do you
thinking.
think, so do you think that with large language models being similarly opaque, will we do better in trying to understand them in terms of why they are giving some answer that they're doing, and maybe there's an
As
analogy
opposed
they.
to other. Yeah, I think that going back to that analogy that, what they're trying to do is just work with what's projected into the outside world and just looking at the fact that, oh, lots of times when people have talked about Google, they've also talked about nowadays, they talk about Gemini.
Yeah.
That's what they're working from.
Yeah.
But in a way, that's kind of backwards because it's looking, as I said, looking at the end result of thinking, but not looking at thinking and reasoning itself, not looking at intelligence itself. So one way to make them better would be to actually look at this process that starts with thinking and intelligence, and then how that gets translated into language, and trying to look at the intermediate steps in between those two.
Yeah.
So that I think is what Chomsky and I and the cognitive scientists have tried to do over the years, is try to understand what's really going on with that process of moving from thinking and reasoning to language.
No, it's really interesting, and I think this is a good segue into how you think the role of AI will shape society going ahead. Because from much of what you've said, and I'm going to sort of crassly oversimplify it,
Sure.
it seems to be that there is much ado about nothing. But at the same time, in the world outside, as in you can't go a single sentence at a dinner table conversation without AI coming up in some shape or form or the other. So, looking ahead, two questions. What what do you think is the role that AI will play in shaping our lives? And maybe a second one, if is what do you think what role do you think it should play?
Uh, yeah, no, two big questions. So the first is, despite the fact that these systems really don't know, what Google means or what Gemini means, nonetheless, like any tool, uh, they do, I think, have some engineering or application use. And it's certainly true that you can use them in ways that I think, from what in my own experience, actually can increase productivity. So even though I know that the systems don't understand what a scientific paper might be about, nonetheless, in the same way that even spreadsheets and other such tools, even going back to think about things like typewriters, actually sped up these processes of being able to digest large amounts of information, those can assist us in many ways. So this goes back to the very beginnings of the computer age. So it might be of some historical interest for your listeners to know that one of the beginnings of the information age was when people used to process information on those things they used to call punch cards. So where did those come from? Well, those were a productivity aid, and they first arose because in the United States, when they had to tabulate the population census, which they had to do every 10 years, they found out in one census, they projected, oh, we have to do the next census in 10 years, but it took us almost 10 years to to compile the one we just had finished. So if that's true, we're just going to fall further and further behind. So that was the point at which they actually uh, um, international business machines and companies of this sort came up with the idea of inventing just even tabulating and sorting machines that used punch cards, which eventually led to modern computational methods.
So
Oh,
just
that's right.
for information, what did these punch cards do?
Well, you could encode the information about what say you were recording information about a person and where they lived and so on, then you would punch holes in different places. And so it was a way of recording information. And that in turn, this is again just being a little bit of history that one might think of. I mean, when people developed weaving machines in the middle of the 19th century, this is what were called jacquard looms. They also used little uh, forms of tablets with holes in them, punches that would tell the loom how to proceed in the way to weave a particular pattern. So it's a way of storing information. And that turned out to speed up the process of weaving. And then, as I said, then later on, it was used to speed up the way of tabulating and sorting, uh, you know, information about populations. And now we have these machines that are much, much more sophisticated in the way they can store information and retrieve it. But I think at heart, they're all systems of the same sort. They're all information systems. And those can be very helpful in dealing with the fact that we're, of course, drowning in seas of information now, and we do have to manipulate it and use it in some, beneficial fashion. And I think towards that end, the modern language models can be of some great aid because we just
So
can't do it anyway.
I'm just reminded of what Steve Jobs said about the computer, that a computer is like a bicycle of the mind. Uh,
Yes,
and there, I'm just thinking of it differently now that you say it. It's again about speed, right? Like human beings can't run as fast as
exactly
the
so.
cheetah, but can invent a cycle. But to do what? To go faster than the cheetah. So it's essentially. So are you saying then that AI is also going to go in the direction where it's going to be about speed and productivity and those human activities which can be done better, but there are some other more fundamental ones, how human beings are interacting, where you
That's right.
simply
So I
cannot be
think
as.
that I think at least for the foreseeable future, we're going to see the machines being able to again speed up as all sorts of engineering advances of this sort have done from the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution to the modern day. I mean, they essentially accelerate those kinds of activities. And the extent to which they accelerate them, they can assist us in innovation. But I don't think they're going to be in the fundamental way more than what, as Jobs said, a bicycle of the mind. That is, they'll let us go faster and faster, but I think the actual creativity is still going to lie with human beings and actually
But maybe this is a
generate.
maybe this is a counterpoint to that, because Sora creates some great art. You can see lots of AI generated art now. Some of it actually looks quite nice, some of it
Yeah,
not so much. But that's just like any other art. I mean, I may not like some
that's right.
design others.
That's right.
Uh, and creativity doesn't strike me as a process which is about speed. It may be some, I haven't thought about it deeply, but it's certainly something else. Just it's not about speed. So what would you say to when you see something like AI generated art? What's happening there?
Well, as you say, I mean, in part, it's just the sheer volume of it. So if it's just generating associations, then the art itself also is in that way kind of associative. And then
Mm,
it's again the external observer. So it goes back to Turing's idea that if you see something, it's the observer who says, "Oh, this is art," or not. The
exactly.
system itself has no internal idea of what's good or bad about that, but it's rather us that remain fundamental to the system in the end. So, so particularly with things that are creative, that's going to be something where it's still people that lie at the center of that. So then that goes ties back to your question about what are the possible, you, you know, kinds of dangers. And I think one of the inherent dangers is would would you want to actually hand over to a system that in and of itself doesn't really understand what's going on and what it's actually just produced or what some other system has produced? Would you want to hand over agency to that? That seems a little bit of a delicate matter to me
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
because again, uh, perhaps to take another analogy, you can imagine a system assisting someone who say is a lawyer and sorting through many cases and then being able to present to you uh, some kind of list of that. But I think the human agent in the end remains fundamental to assessing, what actually is ethically, good and what is not so ethically good. So we can imagine various kinds of aids for that, but I don't think that we can replace the judgment of what a person can actually do.
No, that's right. So one last question, since we are almost out of time. I don't know whether time disappeared. I could go on. But one last question, which is on how this AI race seems to be developing, because one, you see nation states competing with each other, and you see this phenomenon of techno-nationalism, where I don't know, America has its own kind of AI behemoths. China's doing its own thing. Others like India are trying to catch up. So I think there's that where countries are kind of closing in, and that's kind of generally happening, and in AI as well. And at the same time, you see that the major developments are happening in large tech corporations, either in Silicon Valley or in China, where a lot of these products seem to be emanating. So, do you have a thought in terms of how this global framework for AI will develop in terms of governance? As in, will it be countries doing their own thing and selling their products to the world? Or do you think that it will be more international in some way, like the internet was, which was essentially code? As Lawrence Lessig said famously, that law is code. So it was essentially how it was coded. How do you see the development of AI in light of this geopolitical situation we are in?
Well, as a one of these American folk heroes who's actually not a cricket player but a baseball player, so it won't be
Yeah.
perhaps of interest, once said, "Prediction is difficult, especially about the future." Right? So so it makes one hesitate to say something more, that goes out more than 5 or 10 years. But at least to my mind, we're entering some kind of era of heightened nationalism, where many states are have somehow embraced this, and so I think that's going to be a period where. This nationalist tendency will lead to a kind of parcelation of expertise in various topics like AI that's local to that particular nationality. So there will be that kind of competition. So I say that simply to say that I don't think I see the international effort as having much of an effect for at least the very near future, that there is this heightened sense of competition among nations. So I don't know where it's going to lead after that. Uh, the internet was supposed to be a great leveler, but I know personally that the inventor of the internet actually uh, became very saddened after he saw the way that advertising quickly managed to gobble up any sense of this kind of leveling. And to
Right.
my mind, that's the same is going to be true, at least for the near future with the AI systems.
No, that's right. But at least whatever that future is, we can be happy that the nations are led by human beings, very
Yeah,
human, with all their failings,
I could.
and not by artificial machines. And I hope that that day doesn't come, even irrespective of whether we like our leaders or not. At least they are extremely
I agree.
and fundamentally human. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I
No,
agree
great.
100.
Thanks very much, Bob. It was a real pleasure
Oh,
talking to
thank
you.
you.
Lots to unpack. I could go on for much longer, but I think we better
It's a
leave
lot
it
of
there. It's been a pleasure having you. Thank you.
yeah, pleasure also. Thank you.